I never expected things to fall apart like this. 10 years of marriage to Alexander, and everything now feels routine, mechanical. We got married young, full of dreams and plans. He was charming, ambitious, and his drive was infectious. But somewhere along the way, his drive turned into obsession, and I became an afterthought. Alexander was always busy with work, and I was proud of his success. He'd leave early in the morning, and I'd barely see him until late at night when he'd come home exhausted. The few times he was home, he'd check emails or take calls, his mind far away from me. We'd have dinner in silence, eat quickly, and then retreat to our separate corners of the house. Sometimes, he'd mention something about his day, but I couldn't even get a real conversation out of him anymore. And the worst part? I stopped trying to get his attention. It felt futile. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one evening, staring at my empty coffee cup. The silence felt suffocating. I was trying to occupy myself with something, anything, but nothing worked. I couldn't shake the emptiness that had settled in me. I thought back to the early days, when Alexander would come home and ask me about my day, make me laugh with his silly jokes. Now, it all seemed so far away, like it belonged to a different time. I didn't know it yet, but that emptiness would eventually lead me somewhere I never thought I'd go. And then my mother, Lisa, remarried. She met Harrison, a man 15 years older than her, a former lawyer who now worked as a consultant. He was confident, magnetic. People were drawn to him. He had this energy that commanded attention, and that was something my mother hadn't felt in years. I was happy for her at first. She'd been alone for so long, and I could see how much she enjoyed his company. But there was a shift in her. She wasn't the same. She was young again, full of life, and it made me realize how stagnant everything around me had become. They married quickly, just a few months after meeting. I don't know if I was jealous or just disillusioned, but there was something unsettling about it all. I couldn't help but feel like an outsider in their world, in their happiness. My mother was glowing, radiant even, but there was something about it that made me feel small, invisible. I had Alexander, yes, but we had become two strangers sharing a house. The wedding celebration was extravagant. Everything was perfect. There was laughter, music, and the atmosphere was full of new beginnings. But as I looked around the room at all the happy faces, I couldn't help but feel out of place. I tried to be happy for my mother, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't part of this joy. I didn't know anyone here except for my mom, and the crowd felt foreign to me. Harrison's friends were charming, but they were too different from the people I was used to. They seemed so sure of themselves, and I felt like a ghost, drifting in and out of conversations. I spent most of the evening in the background, watching my mother with Harrison, marveling at the way they looked at each other, how effortlessly they moved in sync. I should have been happy, but instead, I felt bitter. I was married, yes, but my marriage was nothing like this. I thought about Alexander, about how we used to be full of excitement. Now, I couldn't even remember the last time we'd shared a genuine moment. It wasn't long after the wedding that I had my first real conversation with Harrison. It was just the two of us in the kitchen one afternoon. My mother was out running errands, and I had stayed behind to help with some of the cleanup. Harrison was there, casually making himself a drink. He asked me how I was adjusting to their new life together. At first, I thought it would be just another polite exchange, something to fill the silence. But Harrison was different. He really listened. It wasn't just small talk. He wanted to know how I felt about everything, about my marriage, about life in general. His tone was warm, empathetic, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like someone cared about what I had to say. "I know it's a big change for you," he said, leaning against the counter. "It's not easy seeing your mom so happy, but you have to take care of yourself, too. Don't lose who you are." It struck me. I hadn't thought about it that way. I'd been so consumed with taking care of everyone else, trying to salvage my marriage, trying to keep up appearances. I hadn't even stopped to think about myself in years. The more time I spent at my mother's house, the more Harrison and I spoke. It started with small conversations, but over time, we began talking about deeper things. I shared with him how I felt about my marriage, about how Alexander had become emotionally distant. Harrison listened with such attentiveness, and he gave me advice that felt different. He said things like, "You need to remember that a relationship is a partnership, not just two people coexisting in the same space." I didn't realize it at the time, but these little exchanges were having an effect on me. I began to feel like Harrison wasn't just offering advice. He was genuinely interested in me. And when he asked about Alexander, how things were between us, I found myself confiding in him in a way I hadn't with anyone in years. He would often remark, "Alexander seems so focused on everything else. I'm sure you miss the connection you used to have." His words felt like a knife in my gut. How did he know? Was it that obvious? I began to spend more and more time at my mom's house. I found myself seeking out Harrison's company, even when my mom wasn't around. He was kind, he listened, and he made me feel seen. I started to look forward to our talks. I told him things I hadn't even shared with Alexander, about how I felt invisible, how I longed for emotional connection. Harrison seemed to understand all of it, and when he spoke, I could tell he wasn't just trying to make me feel better. He genuinely seemed to care. "Maybe you should talk to Alexander about this," he suggested one evening, after I told him how unhappy I was. "But don't just talk. Make him listen. You deserve to be heard." His advice was starting to make sense, but there was something more to it. I had been so used to Alexander's indifference that Harrison's warmth felt like a lifeline. One evening, after we'd spent hours talking on the terrace, sipping wine, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Connection. Harrison was not just offering advice anymore. He was making me feel understood, valued, important. It was something I hadn't realized I was missing, something I thought I could get from Alexander. But Alexander wasn't here. He hadn't been here for a long time. Harrison was patient, thoughtful, and he never rushed me. He just listened, and that was enough. As we sat there, our conversation meandering from one topic to the next, I felt myself opening up to him in a way I hadn't with anyone. I didn't even realize it at the time, but the lines between comfort and attraction were starting to blur, and that's when I started wondering, is this just conversation, or am I starting to feel something more for him? But no, I couldn't think like that. I was married, after all. The weeks that followed felt like a blur. Harrison and I continued to have these long, deep conversations, and with each one, I felt myself getting closer to him. He had this way of listening, of truly hearing what I was saying, and it was something I hadn't experienced in so long. I started to look forward to our talks, craving them, needing them. My feelings for him were growing, and I couldn't stop it. One evening, after a family gathering, everyone had gone home, leaving just Harrison and me alone in the house. It felt like the world had shrunk to just the two of us. I was on the stairs, heading upstairs to grab my bag when I saw Harrison at the bottom, looking up at me. He asked if everything was okay, and I could hear the concern in his voice. I wanted to tell him everything, but the words stuck in my throat. I felt torn, confused. My emotions were all over the place. But then, before I could stop myself, Harrison stepped closer. I saw something in his eyes, this hunger, this quiet intensity, and I couldn't resist. Without thinking, I stepped down toward him, and suddenly his lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative even, but it quickly deepened. It felt like an explosion, a release of all the emotions I had bottled up inside. This wasn't just a kiss. It was everything I had been feeling for so long, everything I had been denying. It was passion, it was connection, it was betrayal. I pulled away, breathless, my heart racing. But there was no regret, not yet. Just an overwhelming sense of exhilaration. It felt wrong and right all at once. The next few days were a whirlwind. I tried to go back to my normal routine, but it was impossible. Every moment felt like I was carrying a secret, a weight that was slowly growing heavier with every passing minute. But when I saw Harrison again, when we kissed again, everything else faded. I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about physical attraction. There was something deeper, something raw that I couldn't explain. Each touch, each kiss, pulled me further into his world. We spent more time together, and each time we were alone, the passion between us grew stronger. I couldn't stop myself. I should have felt guilty, and part of me did. But the rest of me was addicted to this feeling, to the connection I had with Harrison. When I left his house one evening, my heart was heavy with guilt, but it was also filled with a sense of exhilaration. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. At home, things with Alexander were becoming more strained. He started to notice the changes in me, the way I avoided him, the way I was always preoccupied with something else. I was constantly making excuses to leave the house, to avoid spending time with him. I didn't want to confront the reality of what was happening, but I couldn't deny the distance between us. He started asking questions, and I brushed him off with vague answers, pretending like everything was fine. But Alexander wasn't stupid. He began to notice the signs, the subtle shifts in my behavior. I wasn't present anymore, not in the way I used to be. I could see the suspicion in his eyes, but I ignored it, hoping he wouldn't press any further. But it didn't take long before he started digging deeper. I didn't know it at the time, but Alexander had started investigating. He hired a private investigator, a man who would follow me around and find out where I was, what I was doing, and with whom. At first, I thought it was paranoia. Surely, he couldn't have suspected me. But the more I tried to avoid him, the more questions he asked, the more certain I became that he knew something was wrong. The investigator did his job. He followed me and Harrison, documenting everything. It wasn't long before he came back with photographs, clear, undeniable evidence of what had been happening. There we were, Harrison and I, leaving a hotel room together. We were smiling, laughing, looking like a couple in love. I didn't know how to process the images when Alexander showed them to me. There they were, printed on glossy paper, capturing the betrayal in all its clarity. I could see the anger in Alexander's eyes as he held them in front of me. I wanted to speak, to explain, but I couldn't. The guilt washed over me, but it wasn't just guilt. It was fear, too. Fear of the consequences of what I had done. Alexander didn't say much after that. He didn't have to. The photograph spoke louder than anything he could have said. He was hurt, angry, betrayed. Everything I had feared. And I knew, in that moment, that everything was about to change. The life I had known, the marriage I had been in, was over. The day Alexander confronted me, everything I had built up inside me collapsed. We were alone at home, the quiet between us suffocating. He didn't say a word at first, just stood there, looking at me with an expression I couldn't place. Then, he held up the photographs, the ones from the hotel room. There we were, caught in the most intimate, most undeniable moment of betrayal. I could feel the air shift as his voice broke the silence. "Is this how far things have gone, Julianne?" he asked, his voice cold but full of hurt. "You and Harrison?" At first, I froze. I couldn't speak. My mouth went dry, and my heart pounded in my chest. The weight of those photographs hit me like a physical blow. My mind raced, scrambling for an explanation, but no words came. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to tell him it wasn't what it seemed, that it was just a mistake, that it meant nothing. But the truth was right there, staring at me, and I couldn't look him in the eyes and lie anymore. The guilt weighed down on me like 1,000 pounds. "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said finally, my voice shaking. "It just happened. I didn't know how else to deal with the distance between us. You were never here, Alexander. You were always so distant. I felt invisible. And then Harrison, he listened. He understood me in a way you haven't for so long." Alexander didn't speak at first. He just stood there, staring at me with a look of disbelief and betrayal. I could see the shock in his eyes, the pain that radiated from him. But it wasn't just anger. There was a deep, heart-wrenching sadness that seemed to take over him. "I don't want to hear your excuses, Julianne," he said, his voice suddenly colder than I had ever heard it. "You've betrayed me, and worse, you've betrayed us both. I trusted Harrison. He was my friend. But now I see what kind of man he is, and what kind of woman you've become. I opened my mouth to speak, to apologize, to beg him to understand. But nothing came out. The words were stuck, caught in the pit of my stomach. His pain was too much. He was right. I had betrayed him, and there was nothing I could say to take it back. I'm leaving, he said, his voice resolute. I can't stay here. I'm filing for divorce. I don't think there's anything left for us to salvage. And just like that, everything I had known was shattered. I could see the finality in his eyes, the decision already made. He wasn't going to forgive me. There was no second chance, no room for healing. The trust between us was gone, irreparably broken. His words echoed in my mind as I stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe. Alexander turned away from me, walking out of the room without another word. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, my heart aching. I wanted to run after him, to make him understand, but I knew it was too late. He was already gone. In the days that followed, Alexander became a stranger. He wasn't the man I had married, the man I had once loved. The person who had replaced him was cold, distant, and indifferent. He refused to speak to me, refused to acknowledge my attempts at an apology. Every time I tried to approach him, he withdrew further. He wouldn't talk about the divorce. He wouldn't talk about what had happened. He wouldn't even look at me. It was as if I had ceased to exist in his world. I tried to apologize, to explain myself, to make him see that it wasn't about Harrison, that I still cared about him. But my words fell on deaf ears. The man who had once held me and told me everything would be okay now couldn't even look at me. His pain had turned into a wall, and I was on the other side of it, unable to reach him. Every day, it got harder. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I felt the weight of my guilt pressing down on me, suffocating me. I wanted to undo everything, to go back in time and fix it, but I knew I couldn't. The damage had been done, and in some twisted way, I felt like I deserved this cold indifference, this distance. The worst part was that I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know if I even could. In the days after the confrontation, the coldness between Alexander and me only deepened. He became a shadow of the man I had once known, retreating further into himself with each passing day. He gave me the silent treatment, nothing more than a few terse words when absolutely necessary. His eyes, once full of love, were now void of any warmth or recognition. I felt like I was living with a stranger. Every question I asked was met with indifference, every apology dismissed as meaningless. It was worse than any argument we had ever had. His silence, his complete emotional withdrawal, ate away at me. It left me questioning if there was any hope left for us, if reconciliation was even possible. But no matter how much I wanted to reach out, to fix things, I felt powerless. Instead of confronting me head-on or causing a dramatic fight, Alexander chose a far colder path. He didn't yell, didn't accuse, didn't even try to engage me in any real discussion. Instead, he began to manipulate my emotions, making me feel as though I was beneath him, unworthy of any attention or consideration. He ignored my needs completely, canceled plans we once enjoyed, and dismissed my attempts to speak to him. When I tried to explain myself, to apologize, he simply shut me down with curt sentences. Sometimes, he would just walk away in the middle of a conversation. It was as if I had become nothing more than a nuisance to him. This indifference, this treatment as if I were invisible, was unbearable. It hurt more than any argument could. Every time I tried to talk to him, to get him to see how much I regretted my actions, he shut me out even more. And with each passing day, I began to realize that maybe there was no coming back from this. The trust we had once shared was completely shattered, and I was left with nothing but the ruins of my own mistakes. And then there was Greta. I didn't see it coming at first, but Alexander started spending more time with her, Lisa's longtime friend, a woman I had always trusted. Greta was someone I had confided in over the years, a maternal figure who had always been there for me. I knew she had her own struggles, but I never imagined she could be part of the betrayal I was already dealing with. At first, it seemed innocent enough. Alexander would mention taking her out for business dinners or casual outings. He always spoke of their friendship as if it were nothing more than that. But soon, it became clear that there was more going on. The way he talked about Greta, the way he looked at her, there was something there, something I couldn't ignore. I started to notice the little things. The way they would exchange glances when they thought no one was looking, the quiet smiles shared between them. Greta began to drop hints about their friendship, and it didn't take long for me to see that it wasn't just innocent. She was feeding me bits and pieces of information that all but confirmed my suspicions. I couldn't believe it. Not only had I been betrayed by Alexander, but now someone I had trusted, someone I had considered a close ally, was part of the same betrayal. The more I saw them together, the more desperate I became. I tried to reach out to Alexander, tried to explain how much I regretted everything, how much I wanted to fix things. But every time I tried to talk, he pushed me further away. His coldness grew, and so did my desperation. The guilt, the regret, it was suffocating. But no matter how much I apologized, no matter how many tears I shed, it didn't make a difference. Alexander had made up his mind, and he was done with me. But he wasn't just finished with me emotionally. He was taking control of everything. He started making decisions without consulting me, taking control of the finances, the household, every aspect of our life that I once had a say in. I felt trapped, like I no longer had any authority in my own life. He was slowly, methodically taking away my power, my independence. It was as if he was preparing for the divorce that was inevitably coming, and he wanted to make sure he had the upper hand. Alexander's behavior wasn't just about punishing me, it was about controlling me. Every little action was calculated, designed to make me feel powerless, insignificant. And it was working. I felt like I had lost everything. My marriage, my dignity, my sense of self. I didn't know how to reverse the damage. I didn't know how to stop the wheels of destruction that had already started turning. And then, in a final act of revenge, Alexander did something that I could never have expected. He made sure everyone knew the full extent of my betrayal. At a family gathering, he casually dropped the bombshell. In front of our closest friends, he told them about the affair I had had with Harrison. He didn't shout, didn't even raise his voice. He simply spoke about it as though it were a fact, as if it were something that everyone should know. The room went silent. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, judgment and disbelief written on their faces. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. In that moment, all the shame, all the guilt, all the consequences of my actions hit me full force. Not only had I lost Alexander's trust, but now my reputation was tarnished in front of everyone I knew and loved. I was humiliated. I wanted to shrink into the floor, to disappear, but I couldn't. The damage was done, and the world now knew the truth. I could see the satisfaction in Alexander's eyes. He had one. As the weeks passed after Alexander's revelation, I found myself sinking deeper into isolation. It wasn't just that I had lost my husband. It was that I had lost everything. My relationship with Alexander, once a source of comfort, was now a distant memory. And as if that weren't enough, my mother, Lisa, began to distance herself from me too. She couldn't handle the truth, the reality of what had happened between her daughter and her new husband. The shame was too much for her to bear, and she pulled away. I tried reaching out to her, trying to salvage what we had, but she wasn't able to confront the situation. Every time I tried to talk to her, to explain my side, I was met with silence. She could no longer look me in the eyes without thinking of the betrayal. The isolation became unbearable. I felt like I was losing everything. My marriage, my family, my friends, and, worst of all, my own dignity. It was as though I had been stripped bare, left with nothing but the weight of my guilt. No one was there for me. I had no support, no one who truly understood the depth of my regret. Every day felt like I was sinking further into a void. Meanwhile, Alexander thrived in his newfound freedom. He embraced it with a quiet confidence that I couldn't ignore. He seemed to get stronger, more assured with each passing day. The control he had once lost, the power that had slipped from his grasp when I betrayed him, was now his again, and he knew it. He began seeing Greta openly, their relationship blossoming in front of my eyes, and with every interaction, I could feel my own irrelevance in his life. Alexander was no longer the man I had married. The man I once knew was gone, replaced by someone far more calculated, far more focused on his own well-being. He wasn't just moving on, he was thriving. While I remained in the wreckage of what I had done, he was building a new life for himself. He grew stronger, not just personally but professionally, using everything that had happened as a catalyst for his own growth. I watched all of this from the sidelines, helpless, unable to reverse the tide of change that had swept through our lives. It was as if the life we had shared was being erased, one decision at a time, and I couldn't stop it. I wasn't even a part of the story anymore. I was just a ghost watching Alexander reclaim everything he had lost, and more. I couldn't accept it, though. I tried one last time to reach out to him. I begged him, pleaded with him to give us another chance. I promised that I would change, that I would work on being the wife he deserved. But it was too late. He looked at me with cold detachment, a man who had learned everything he needed to from our betrayal. His words were like ice, cutting through any hope I had left. "It's too late for apologies, Julianne. I've learned too much to ever trust you again." In that moment, the weight of it all hit me. The man I had once loved, the man who had once loved me, was gone. His love for me had died in the same way our marriage had. Slowly, quietly, without me even realizing it was happening. And now, there was nothing left. No chance for reconciliation, no second chance. The finality of it was crushing. But Alexander wasn't done. To assert his complete control, he visited my mother. He took a more active role in her life, offering support and reassurance in the aftermath of everything that had happened. He played the part of the caring, attentive man, even though I knew deep down that it was all a power move. He had already taken everything from me, my marriage, my family's trust, my reputation, and now he was solidifying his hold over my mother as well. It was a subtle, calculated move, but it was clear. Alexander had won. He had completely reasserted his dominance over my life and over my family. He had succeeded in teaching me the lesson he had always wanted to teach. I had no one left to turn to. No husband, no mother, no friends. All of my emotional and social ties had disintegrated, leaving me utterly alone. As I walked through our old home, the home that had once been filled with memories of laughter and love, I couldn't escape the realization that everything had unraveled. I stopped in front of a picture frame on the wall, one of the few photographs left from happier times. I couldn't help but feel a sharp pang of regret. I thought about how quickly everything had fallen apart, how easily I had lost it all. In the end, there was no one left to share the burden of my mistakes. The harshest lesson of all was that trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild. No amount of apologies, no amount of regret could undo the damage I had done. I had destroyed my marriage, my family, and my reputation, and there was no going back. Alexander, on the other hand, had fully moved on. He looked at the past with clarity, seeing it as a lesson learned, a painful but necessary step in his growth. He was stronger now, more confident, and he had rebuilt his life from the ashes of our broken relationship. His relationship with Greta continued to grow, and he moved forward with a renewed sense of purpose. He had one. I, on the other hand, was left with nothing but the weight of my mistakes, a constant reminder of how easily everything had slipped through my fingers. And as I reflected on my choices, both the affair and the betrayal of my husband, I realized that the damage I had caused was irreversible. The scars would never fade.